once we get to pretty much a regenerated state, then we need to steward that improved land, or we've got to steward what we have developed. And so the steward stage is all about maximizing the return on asset, which is a bit more of that economics component. And a lot of it has to do with experimenting on your farm. So we've almost stripped out a lot of the inputs by the time we get to transform. Can we add some things back to maximize, say, our yields or maximize the return on asset?
This podcast is brought to you by GroundShift. If you're anything like me, you've probably realised that doing things the way they've always been done doesn't always lead to better outcomes on the farm. And that's where GroundShift comes in. GroundShift is all about helping farmers rethink the way that they approach their soils, the inputs into their system, and improving their overall farm system performance. We focus on building resilience, improving efficiency, and ultimately creating more profitable farm systems. It's not always about throwing more into your system. Sometimes it's about understanding what's driving those results beneath the surface. So if you're serious about improving your farm's profitability and resilience, and utilising biology to drive your farm system performance, I highly recommend checking out groundshift.ag, and you can follow them online at groundshift.ag on Instagram. Welcome back to another episode of From the Soil Up podcast. Today's special guest is Teal Simmons from Agrisol in Australia. I've been following Teal for some time now, particularly on YouTube. He's got some of the best educational videos on there in relation to farming, but also regenerative farming, and just breaking down a lot of the key concepts in a very easy way to understand. So I'm stoked to be chatting into him today. We're going to talk about the profitability around regen transition, because there's a lot of what I would say philosophy and not enough of the economics talked about. So this is going to be a great conversation today. So Teal, how are you today?
Yeah, good. Thanks for that intro. That's fantastic.
I don't think I need to re-record that one. So Teal, do you think Regen Ag has a perception problem, and that it can largely be a lot of philosophy and not enough of the economics?
Yeah, 100%. And I think the problem is it's on both sides. So it's from there's a perception problem from the conventional side, but also I think there's a problem even within the regenerative space itself. And so, and I think it all comes around economics, where the conventional side goes, it's theoretically it's all just perception, it's just all kind of greenies. And then kind of within that regen side, I think people might feel bad about making money. What's really important is there's a middle approach, and it's not completely getting rid of, say, inputs or maximizing input use. It's just what's going to be the best outcome for our land, but also generate the highest return on assets possible. A really good saying I love is you can't be green if you're in the red. And I think, it just sums up regen really well.
Yeah, I like that saying too. And I always regularly keep saying there is you can't be sustainable or regenerative if your business isn't profitable. That's not ultimately a regenerating business. That's a really key concept to it. So how do we, bring that economics to the philosophy, do you think?
I think it's taking a step back and really understanding the agronomics, behind what you're doing. And really, the big part of the economics behind ag is pretty much your nutritional inputs. And so it's, how do we take the philosophy of, okay, microbes can supply our nutrition to our plants and utilize that, but also understand the economics behind that. So, for example, in some cases, and you look at, say, Gay Brown, pretty much majority of their inputs are coming from microbes, which are coming from ultimately their soil parent material. And so that's where the economics really align with the philosophy, where it's, we don't have to spend any money on inputs, which is fantastic. And we're utilizing that regenerative philosophy of microbes to really drive business profits. Yeah, so I'm not too sure exactly how do you bring them together, except I know really understand what's going on in your business and what you're trying to achieve with your applications or your practices.
Yeah, no, it's kind of one of those areas that I'm furiously trying to work away on and pull, the financials alongside the biologicals and all these practices. How do they actually all interlink, and understanding how that fits in different contexts, because no two contexts are the same. So she's a big mission, but that's something that I personally would love to bring a lot more, or highlight around here, at least in a New Zealand context, that can hopefully then be used more widely. But before we get into this topic a bit more deeply, I'd love you to be able to give us a bit of an introduction on yourself and share a bit more about your background.
Yeah, so I'm Teal Simmons. I'm an independent regenerative agriculture consultant. Originally, I grew up on our family farm in the Hawkesbury, which is located near Sydney. So it's the first agricultural area outside of Sydney, Australia. We had organic veggies and then transitioned to free-range pigs, which was interesting. So I wasn't involved in any of the management decisions, but growing up, it was always that free labour component, which is fun. And then into kind of high school in agriculture, that's when I took a real keen interest in ag. And you get to this point where you learn about something in say, soil science or plants, and you're like, oh, man, that's really interesting. And that sets you down probably that regen route. And for me, it was legumes. And you're like, what? These plants can make free nitrogen fertilizer, which kind of comes back to that economics part. I just thought that was awesome, that you don't need to be spending money on fertilizer if this plant makes it for you. So from there, you just go down this wormhole of, there's legumes, there's nitrogen fixing microbes in your soil that aren't associated with legumes. There's mycorrhizal fungi, there's microbes that protect your plants. And so you just go down this wormhole. And so it really took a massive interest to regenerative agriculture from there. Did an ag science degree at the University of Sydney. During that time, did some work with holistic management in Australia. I was on their monitoring team, so I'd go around to different farms across Australia and assess their ecological health. Did some work with other regenerative companies during uni, and then kind of got to the end of uni. And for me, like the two career options were, you either go sell fertilizer, which is fine, or you become a researcher. And it's not like either one is a bad choice, but for me, like my passion is how do we best manage our systems? And like I could go down, and even in the regenerative space, there's input supplies. But for me, like how do we take these kind of bigger ideas where you can't solve them using inputs? It's cover crops or grazing management, or do we just change a few things in our system? Like there wasn't really a career or job in that at that time. So I started my own business, Agrisol, to help farmers kind of pull all that together.
That's awesome. I think you've highlighted quite an interesting point there around when we see people kind of start getting interested in this area or driving more of a biological approach to their farming, they're playing around with a few practices, but ultimately to get that kind of compounding effect over time where we see the farm really take off and those costs kind of stay the same or maybe even lessen. Do you see in Australia that also needs to be almost like a system approach rather than just playing with a few little things like, cover crop and grazing? It needs to actually be a system level approach to getting the farm to where it needs to go?
Yeah, I think so. Like an integrated approach.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. It's like, say, nitrogen management, for example. There's so many factors we can pull with trying to manage our nitrogen that you really do have to take a systems approach. And it's not just one input or like one practice of, say, adding humic acid to urea. Like that's going to help, but it's not going to be, there is no silver bullets. And what's, I think, beneficial is because agriculture is so variable we're working in a biological system that changes every day, that we shouldn't really be relying on just one or two things, which is where that integrated approach to, I guess, regenerating our farms or delivering nutrition can be really helpful because you're less reliant on just one thing.
Do you find when you start working with a biological system, a lot of people, I think, come from like 1 + 1 = 2 in terms of like the input science and what maybe they're used to with farming, but inherently with biological using biological systems, 1 + 1 doesn't always equal 2, and it can vary what the answer is depending on season and a whole range of factors. So is that something that you, I guess, are seeing when driving or utilising this integrated approach?
Yeah, it's difficult to quantify that, I think. I mean, coming from very much a scientific perspective, it's difficult to say, if I add these two things together, it's going to, like, that's the result I'm going to get, or that it does, say, compound. Actually, most things seem to compound and cascade, and so you might not get so much 1 + 1 = 11. It might just be, it's 1 + 1 = 2 or 3. But it's so difficult to know, I think. Ultimately, it's just taking multiple approaches, I think, to getting that outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And just deciding figuring out what works in your specific context, because that's probably the key thing, is what works for your neighbour inherently may not work for you and may actually result in the outcome that you're not looking for. So I guess the big topic that we really wanted to have a chat about today is about the kind of that transition period and looking into driving your system with a bit more biology and trying to potentially turn in or go down the regenerative path. A lot of people are always worried, particularly in New Zealand, around that you will lose money by heading this way. In your experience with a lot of the farmers that you've worked with, what's kind of the most common mistake that farmers decide to go when they're heading towards a more regenerative path?
Yeah, so the biggest problem is someone will watch, say, Gabe Brown video, and they're fantastic. I think what he's doing is really good. Or they'll watch someone else, and they talk about how they can completely cut out nitrogen or phosphorus fertilizer, and so in their mind they go, "Cool, I can do the same if I just add worm castings or something like that, or magically supply my crop with all this nutrition." So they do that, and they end up with a 50% yield drop, and they go, "What happened here? It's not meant to happen." So the big problem is looking at where someone is in their regenerative journey and applying that bot to where you are and trying to mimic the same practices. But regenerative is really a journey. Like there's a starting point, and you got to start, little things at a time and build on that, rather than say someone is able to cut out their nitrogen applications completely. Like you can't just jump straight to that. You got to build up your system.
And like their nitrogen starting point might be a lot lower than where you're starting as well. So
yes,
it's not comparable. What's the best way that you help farmers when they obviously get inspired by someone like Gabe Brown or see something on YouTube or a podcast? How do you bridge that gap in a way that ensures that they stay kind of grounded and safe, rather than, I'm just going to pull that lever and I'm going to get that awesome outcome that they got?
Yeah, it's just slowing it down. Like it's okay to just go slow and start with very small steps. So for example, a classic one is had a client and they're really, really interested in high density grazing, which is like awesome. But if you don't have the skills to handle that system, like you don't know how to do pasture budgeting, you don't know how to move livestock in a low stress manner, then it's a higher and higher risk. And I think, I guess the problem is what we should be looking at is how much risk are we willing to take on with implementing different practices? And you can for sure just cut your rates and hope something works out, but it's a high risk. And so I think we need to do a better job at managing risk in the transition period, and it's just taking these small steps. So this particular client, they had 7 paddocks. So rather than cutting that up into 70 paddocks, let's just implement these regenerative grazing principles to those 7 paddocks. And it's like you don't have to go super crazy on your practices. You can just go slow step at a time and slowly integrate things.
I think it's quite an important one, because you really get two ends of the scale: people who go slowly, and then those who are less risk averse and just go, I just got to do it, and do it across the whole board. How do you identify like a farmer's risk appetite as part of when you're working with them? Because I think that's actually quite a key point when working with farmers, is understanding their risk appetite, because they're all completely different.
True. I probably don't do a great job at managing that. And I guess from an advisor point of view, and you'd see this too, like to some extent we're liable for our recommendations. And so in my recommendations are more conservative in that. And especially like if you're helping a client manage a multi-million-dollar property with a multi-million-dollar debt, you don't want to be giving, well, I don't want to be giving recommendations that, could really do some damage to their bottom line. So like, cover crops, for example, fantastic, love cover crops. But if you don't manage them properly, you can then run into serious problems in the following year if you take out too much water. So in terms of managing risk, like I prefer to just slow everything down and we can take our time. But really, again, it's up to the farmer. I think a great way of getting around that is you take it slow on pretty much all your paddocks, except one, which is like say your worst paddock, and you just do whatever you want. And so you mitigate the risk. You mitigate downside, and you can do a full multi-species cover crop with no starter fertilizer or a guano starter fertilizer, and go crazy on that. But I think mitigating risk I think is a massive one that need to focus on.
Yeah, I'm very much in the same camp. I've got a great example of someone who wants to like rip 50% of their nitrogen out of their dairy system because the prices are going up, but they've got some opportunity to use some other inputs, and it's like, you got to pull back the reins on them a little bit. We're like, hey, we're not going to do that. We're going to work our way down and see what the system does and let it respond, and build the capacity of, the biology to come in and fill that gap that we'll somewhat create. So it's really interesting, particularly when you are dealing with really big businesses that have big revenue. You don't want to be the one that makes it fall over, but also just recognizing that those risks and being able to articulate those well to the farmer, I think is quite an important part. I guess on the other end of the scale is like when you do see people transitioning to, say, a more regenerative approach to their farming, what we see commonly here in New Zealand, that there is can be a dip in production for, say, 3 or so years, and then we start to see that compounding effect of the system start to really come alive. In an Australian context, is that similar?
Yeah, it depends on how you transition. And so that is that classic drop in production, and then you get that boost at the end. But I think, paying close attention to your agronomics and your practices should be able to avoid that completely. So either be neutral in terms of profit-wise, so you're not spending more because you can spend a lot on regenerative stuff. Or you should be able to make, and it depends, but you should be able to make out with more profit. That's the aim of the game, is to be able to increase the profit, but also your asset base at the same time. It's not an either or. You can definitely do it, but it takes strategy and the right tactics to do that. You can't just cut out all your inputs.
Yeah, I always say you can't starve a profit into a business. So pulling all the stuff out and then hope you're going to make more money. So how do you? Obviously, you take quite the agronomic approach to it. You're not just doing kind of the nutrition by itself. You incorporate the financials as well, which is, I think, you can't make decisions without knowing both. Can you kind of walk us through the framework that you would approach a farm with?
Yeah, for sure. And I guess just touching on that point, so I originally just started with the nutritional piece for clients, but then you really do need to understand the economics behind it, because if you're going to recommend, I could make your farm fantastic, right? But if it's going to cost you more than what the farm's actually worth, then what's the point? So really, you have to integrate I have to integrate all my recommendations with an economic outcome, and whether that's more an unseen economic outcome because you increase your land, your asset value by increasing soil health, or it's a direct outcome. In terms of the framework I like to use for transitioning farmers is what I call the roots framework. And so what I did was I sat down, and there's another framework that this is built off. I sat down and I thought, what are the stages that we can go through in terms of regenerating our farm and transitioning to regenerative agriculture, where we minimise risk and it's structured so we know what we're doing at each particular stage. And so the framework starts off with R for reframe, and this is largely reframing our mindsets to be a bit more a regenerative mindset or a growth mindset. And so to do that, you're probably doing it right now because you're listening to a regenerative podcast. Otherwise, you can watch my videos or someone else's videos, go to field days, speak to people. It's all about trying to understand what is regenerative agriculture, why we're doing these things. And it's super important because once we get to the next few stages, it's really important for you to understand why are we applying a mycorrhizal fungi seed treatment? Why are we applying minerals to the leaves? Why? And having this mindset where you want to discover things rather than shut it down. So we only work with farmers that are at that stage. So they have this regenerative mindset, they've reframed their mindset, and they're ready to move on to the next stage, which is optimize. Optimize is it's a critical stage, which is where when we get this stage wrong, that's when you get the reduction in yields and profits. And so the optimized stage is really increasing the efficiency of all your inputs. And the key to it is you don't want to implement too many new practices. So we're just going to keep all the same practices. We're just going to make them more efficient. So for example, MAP starter fertilizer. There's plenty of problems with MAP starter fertilizer, but if we're thinking of this regenerating our farm as a journey, let's just take a few small steps. So what's something that we can do to improve, say, the efficiency and reduce the biological damage of MAP fertilizer? And a great one is adding humic acid to it. And so for a couple of extra dollars a hectare, you just add your humic acid onto your MAP fertilizer, and then that buffers the phosphorus so it doesn't impact your biology as much, and then it also prolongs the release of that phosphorus so it prevents it from locking up. And so we're not doing anything crazy. We're still putting fertilizer down, we're still using pretty much the same fertilizer that we always have used, but we're just making it a little bit more efficient. And so there's a number of different practices we can do on that level that doesn't add much more complexity to the operation and keeps the risk relatively low because we're not taking these drastic reduction in anything. A great spot with the optimized stage is to reduce your fertilizer input by whatever cost of that additional input is. So say the humic acid is a couple of dollars, you can reduce your MAP fertilizer by a couple of dollars. So it works out neutral. And so with that, you should then see a larger response in your fertilizer. And from there, that's really important because it allows the cash flow for the next stage. So that's the optimized stage, I think, is super critical and shouldn't be skipped because it just sets everything up so well for the next stage, which is the outsource stage. So outsourcing is moving towards more biologically friendly inputs. So say MAP plus humic acid, rather than using that, let's go to guano. And so guano is a lot more biologically friendly. There's more trace minerals, but we're still supplying some kind of input. And so we can do that. That then sets the scene up for the transform stage, which is all about redesigning our system so that the system itself supplies the nutrition to, or say in this case, the nutrition to our plants. This is typically where everyone jumps to when they think about regenerative agriculture. It's cover crops and intercropping and all these things where like it's a complete redesign. And the problem with this stage, if you jump straight to it, is that there's such a learning curve associated with, say, implementing cover crops or intercropping and things like that. Keeping on that nitrogen theme, you can have buckwheat, a buckwheat cover crop, or including buckwheat and cover crop. You can have intercropping with radishes to scavenge some of that phosphorus and prevent it from locking up, and then you can terminate early, and it releases that phosphorus. Actually, in the previous stage, that's when you add all your microbial inoculants, so say phosphorus solubilizing bacteria and mycorrhizal fungi. So that's an outsource. And then finally, at the very end, with S, is steward, because regeneration is really it's a word to describe like progression. I'm not too sure if you can regenerate forever, and that's a bit of an unknown for me. Maybe once we get to pretty much a regenerated state, then we need to steward that improved land, or we've got to steward what we have developed. And so the steward stage is all about maximizing the return on asset, which is a bit more of that economics component. And a lot of it has to do with experimenting on your farm. So we've almost stripped out a lot of the inputs by the time we get to transform. Can we add some things back to maximize, say, our yields or maximize the return on asset?
Yeah, that's a great framework to work with, because it really does simplify each piece of the puzzle. That's quite important. For a farmer starting at refine their mindset and where they are, that's quite a big shift, and I feel like that's actually one of the most important unlocks, because everything else that follows can't happen without that. How long does it typically take for someone to kind of go through that process, do you think, to get to the end of where they're actually stewarding their land and that continuous regeneration? I
think it depends on, like everything, it depends.
Yeah.
Like the reframe stage could go on for a long time. I wouldn't quite put a number on it. It could also happen quite quickly. Like you see one video and you're like, oh, okay, there you go, I'll do that. Or you speak to someone, it could happen very quickly. So I'm not too sure about reframe. Depending on really your rainfall, I think, and the brittleness of your landscape will depend on how quickly you go through the framework. Just from the point of view that the more rainfall you have, the more potential for photosynthesis, which drives kind of the whole system. So typically you might be looking at 1 to 2 years, maybe 3 per stage. And also how much risk you want to take on too. Because you can go, 1 year per stage and really fly through, but you take on more and more risk. So it just depends on what you want to achieve.
Yeah, appetite. I think you've brought up a really, as part of that, a really key focus for me is around photosynthesis and how that drives a lot of what we're doing. Can you explain to the listeners why that is kind of underpins a lot of this process?
Yeah, so photosynthesis is the basis of everything. Like everything in agriculture and regenerative agriculture, it is the one process that is just so important. And I remember sitting in my uni lectures and they're talking about, the nitty-gritties of photosynthesis and all the pathways and all the, different enzymes required to take an electron here and throw it there. And I'm like, I'm never really going to use this. But it's actually super important.
Yeah.
Yeah, so important. So photosynthesis is a process that plants do, and they take carbon dioxide in from the air, they take water, and they combine those two things with the energy from light to produce sugars. And so from there, the plant can then use those sugars for everything. So I think growth, so like pasture growth, just maintenance, so not dying, I guess. Reproduction, which is where your yields come from. And then the most important one is they release those carbons as root exudates. And so that root exudate component is what drives soil development and kind of that soil health and improving soil condition. Because what happens is the plant will release that carbon either as sugars or proteins or lipids, or there's a whole mix of different things in a root exudate. They'll release that to the microbes in the rhizosheath or the rhizosphere, which is a bunch of microbes surrounding that root zone, which is super, super active. And pretty much your microbial activity is nearly directly proportional to the amount of carbon and sugar or energy supplied to them. So in short, like if we maximize the photosynthetic ability of our plants, we maximize the amount of energy and carbon flowing through our system to our microbes. And it's those microbes that really drive the improvement of the system. And so when we look at, say, aggregation and what drives aggregation, it's mycorrhizal fungi releasing glumalin, or it's different bacteria producing biofilms, or even living and dying and then sticking their necromass to soil particles. And so it's photosynthesis that is the start point of everything to do with regeneration.
Well, it's really what we're trying to do as farmers is actually, we're solar farmers and we're trying to harvest as much of that sunlight as efficiently as possible. And if we do that job really well, our profit and the natural capital of the land we're working with generally increases over time. And that's, for me, is why it's like you say, you never think photosynthesis when you learn about it when you're younger is going to be really that important. But I think it's actually the single most important process that we need to understand as farmers is how does that work and how can we do it more efficiently. So how do you get farmers, or what's some really practical levers that a farmer can utilise that can increase that photosynthetic output for their farm? Or is there anything that just pops to your mind that's always massively underutilised?
Yeah, so I guess we're starting from kind of first principles. If we want to maximise photosynthesis, there's kind of two ways we can do it. We can increase the rate of photosynthesis, so say photosynthesis per unit of time. Then we can also maximise the units of time that a plant is photosynthesizing. So to start with the rate of photosynthesis, there's kind of two kind of principles we can use. The first one is maximizing the individual plant's ability to photosynthesize, which largely comes down to, or at least for what we can manage, largely comes down to nutrition. There's other factors like your temperature, your climate, your aspect, like there's a whole bunch of different factors for that. But we can only really manage nutrition in a grazing operation is making sure you leave sufficient amounts of leaf material. In a lot of kind of farming systems, it's nutrition. And so there's 5 key minerals required for photosynthesis. The first one is magnesium. Magnesium is at the very center of the chlorophyll molecule, and that molecule captures the light. So when the light comes in and hits the plant, that's the molecule that captures that light energy. Next, you need iron. Iron is required. It's a cofactor that builds the chlorophyll, as well as carotenoids. We also need manganese, which is used in water hydrolysis, which splits the water for this process. An interesting one that not too many people talk about is copper. Copper is actually required it passes electrons from photosystem 1 to 2. It's like a very small enzyme in it, but you can't do anything else without it. You need phosphorus for ATP. And then another one that's really quite important is nitrogen. And it's really important to manage nitrogen. We need enough to build the chlorophyll because the nitrogen surrounds that magnesium element. But the problem with nitrogen is that if you supply too much, it requires a lot of energy to convert that nitrogen, say nitrate or ammonium, into amino acids. And so if you apply too much, then you're using all this photosynthetates or sugars in order to convert your nitrogen into amino acids. So we need just enough nitrogen to allow the system to work, but not too much where we're using sugars. So that's kind of the first little bit. The next bit is how can we? It's looking at between different plants. So if we can increase the amount of plants and more specifically diversity of plants within an area, then we can also increase the photosynthetic ability that way. That's things like having multi-species cover crops rather than just one species, or intercropping where we have different canopies and different root systems. So that will also increase photosynthesis. And we don't have to be hitting, say, bricks of 12 if we have, say, more overall plants at a bricks of, say, 6. And bricks is just a good proxy. It's limited, but a good proxy on the photosynthetic ability of a plant. And then finally, when we look at photosynthesis across time, we can cover crop, we can pasture crop, we can intercrop too. We can also select for longer maturing varieties to get even a couple of extra weeks in. All of those things, kind of that back end is in that transform stage because it's more or less more risky. When we look at nutrient applications, if we're already going over with a tractor pass and spraying a herbicide or something, we can put out a few trace minerals to then increase the photosynthetic ability of the plant. And so I'm very big on, what are we already doing that we can just, again, optimize and just tweak that so we can get some big wins without adding too much more work for farmers.
That's a very good explanation. One thing I want to pull up here is around like the intercropping and the pasture cropping. A lot of people see that as, it's another expense in the system because they see the seed and everything that goes into that, not the compounding effect. How do you, I guess, optimize around that for a farmer to see that that's actually building that longer term capacity?
Yeah, I guess it's difficult because like, if you're going to come in, if you plant this seed, it's going to generate X amount of turn. Like it's quite difficult, I guess, from that end. Pasture cropping is the easy one because there's a few studies on it, and typically with pasture cropping, rather than say getting 100% return from wheat, you get a 7% return from wheat, and then a 70% return from the grazing enterprise, totaling at 140%, which is more than 100. So that's great. It depends. And that's probably the hardest thing with agriculture, just in general. Like you just don't know it's so hard to quantify the returns you're expected to get from different applications or practices. Yeah,
well, I was hoping you were going to have like the golden nugget there for me to use, but
no, sorry,
very much the same. What I deal with, which is really interesting. In terms of photosynthesis, if we go back to there, is there like a photosynthetic activity below where, we're really struggling to get the biology to respond to what's happening? And it doesn't seem to matter what you're doing. You can't seem to move your farm when it's stuck. Have you come across that before?
Yeah, like not so much a specific threshold. It's what I would imagine. It's more of a linear progression. Mm-hmm. Say we're using the bricks metric. A bricks of 2 is less than 12. I don't think if you hit, say, bricks of 6, then everything takes off. I would assume it's just, if you have a bricks of 6, that's just 3 times more than 2, and 12 is 6 times more than 2. So I'd imagine it's more linear. There's also a function of like limiting factors. Mm-hmm. So if you have a plant with a bricks of 2, then if you do apply mycorrhizal fungi inoculant, is that the best case for your money? Like, because if your plant isn't really going to be feeding your mycorrhizal fungi, then what's the point? You better spend that money on a foliar to increase it. And then once you're at, say, bricks of 12, then, your money might be better spent on a mycorrhizal fungi inoculant or like whatever the application is. But I think it's more of a linear response and then limiting factors rather than a threshold.
Yeah. The bricks is a real interesting one because you can spend quite a lot of money raising the bricks and you've only done it in the short term. So what are your kind of best levers to get something that's relatively low bricks to rise longer term? Because we can shift the dial pretty quickly, and I'm probably talking more in a pasture-based system because we see quite commonly here low bricks, even with a little bit of a diversity in our pastures. But I've always found it relatively hard to shift that on the long term unless there is a systematic change to what they're doing.
Yeah, for sure. Like, it really depends on what is happening. Like, because if you're putting on a heap of nitrogen fertilizer, that's going to be drawing down your sugars. In general, when you talk about bricks and say a foliar application, my understanding is your first foliar application will spike bricks a bit and it'll come down. But that next low point should be higher than your last low point. And so as you build that system and you're working with microbes and you're building that system, it should slowly increase those low points. There's no single bullet. Is that very much integrated approach? But I don't think there's a single application that will improve the system. Individual applications can improve the system, but you really do have to take that integrated approach to regenerating your farm because there's so many limiting factors that you have to take an integrated approach. You have to look at everything because any one of those things could be a limiting factor.
Yeah, I think half the time you're almost like a doctor trying to diagnose what that is, and it can be very hard to figure it out. And what you think is an easy solve generally will never be. So I guess it keeps it fun, and it's just taking that curiosity approach to a lot of it. One thing that we've talked a lot about is nutrition, and I think something like we always see is it's very easy to add nutrition to fill those gaps. But how do you go about trying to unlock what's already in the soil and actually understanding that in the first place?
So it all comes down to measuring like what's going on in your farm. And so I'm a big fan of total soil tests, as well as like a normal soil test, and then also SAP tests or a tissue test or whatever your choice of looking at the plant is. And so we need to appreciate that our soils are a function of our geology. There's so many different parent materials that influence that as a result of that particular parent material, will result in a different soil type. So, for example, where I live, we've got a heap of Hawkesbury sandstone. Sandstone is pretty much weathered down, or it is weathered down rock. It's all the parts that couldn't weather down further, recompressed into a new rock, and then the soils as a result of that just super sandy and already nutrient depleted. Mm-hmm. So whereas like if you go up to say northern New South Wales and they've got these really beautiful clayey soils, it's a function of the geology, and ultimately we can't really change geology. We can only work with it and understand it. So with a test that we like to do, it's firstly understanding what minerals are from our parent material. There's some places you just simply don't have copper. You don't have lignum. I think northern New Zealand, there's like no cobalt or something like that.
There's no selenium. Basically anywhere here. Yeah, across the whole country, it's a bit like cobalt's pretty low across the board generally. Zinc. So a lot of those trace elements are not there in an available form.
So it's understanding, I guess, that because they are the true capital applications we have to make if we're gonna supply that mineral, because we simply don't have it from our geology. Yeah. Where it's interesting is when you start looking at the difference between what your soils have in the parent material. So say you got a lot of phosphorus. I've been to a farm where they had 2,000 parts per million of phos. It was a dairy farm, and they just kept putting their manure there in that paddock. They had 2,000 parts per million of phos, but they were more or less deficient in their available. At that point where you have the mineral backing of that particular mineral, you don't have it in the available, that's a biological function to release that from the totals. And so when I say that, it is, okay, how do we increase the biological function of our soil to release that? And then, but also still supplying that nutrition, because we don't want to have our plant basically suffer a yield drop because we're not supplying that nutrition. Ultimately, we've got to make sure our plants are just getting the nutrition it needs. And whether it's coming from the parent material through biology or an input, like if we're going to try and target a particular yield, then you have to make sure that nutrition is getting to the plant. And then I guess the other one is differential sap test or tissue test. We can check all that to make sure what the plant currently has now, and then we can backtrack through those other tests to see what's stopping where. Is there anything going to antagonise something else? Do we have it in the mineral component? Yeah, it's really taking a whole systems approach, as we've been talking about, to understanding what's going on.
You mentioned a great example there around high amounts of phosphorus locked up and not a lot available. It's very common in New Zealand because we have quite a good history of superphosphate use. How do you approach that particular situation to try and unlock that phosphorus?
Yeah, it's really difficult, and especially in Australia. Like I've seen farms where their total phosphorus is 75 parts per million, which like I'm assuming you guys probably have higher than 75 in your available. And so it's, well, firstly, like, do we have the phosphorus in our parent material? If we do, then we can unlock it. If we don't, then we probably have to apply it if we want to hit a yield target. I'm currently not of the mindset, I guess, that we can just make as many minerals as we want. I don't know if that's currently where I'm in my regenerative journey. I don't know about biological transmutation or those kind of things, or if you just have the biology there, then it's fine. They might work on, say, in North America where they have really good soils. I don't know, but I'm also not like bold enough to say I'm right on this. I might be wrong.
No, I think you're right. Like it comes back to, if it's not there in the parent material and it's not in that total, like you can't just kind of pull it out of thin air.
Yeah, that's probably that perception in regen that gets like the bad rap. It's that wooey, too wooey. But say, assuming we do have the phosphorus in, or whatever mineral in our parent material, then we need to stimulate biology by increasing the photosynthetic ability of the plant to then feed that biology to then get that phosphorus. So mycorrhizal fungi are a fantastic one, as well as phosphorus solubilizing bacteria. They're just, all these microbes can go to these rock particles and just mine them. Like they release different enzymes and acids to increase the solubility of, say, phosphorus, and then they can supply it back to the plant. But as we talked about with photosynthesis, like these microbes need carbon and energy to do that, which is where what I think is probably the best way to do this is if we stimulate photosynthesis to then feed the microbes to then get the minerals and then bring it back up to the plant, that's probably the most economic way of completing that cycle. Whereas different concepts in regen ag, you might be applying, trying to stimulate the microbial component first with compost or inoculants. And inoculants are good in addition to maximising photosynthesis. But if you're just doing, say, microbial inoculants without the other pieces, then it might not work. Or if you're just taking the mineral approach but without the other parts, that might not work. Yeah, it's really thinking about this flow from plants to microbes to soil and then back up through.
And as a key part of that, looking into things like foliar nutrition so you can feed the plant well.
Yeah. So foliar nutrition is a great one when say it's in that parent material and we just need to give that plant a little application of those minerals. It's like iron is a fantastic example. Everyone has plenty of iron unless you're on beach sand. So you pretty much have enough iron. The problem with iron is that it can oxidize quite easily and become unavailable to the plant. So to get that plant to, say, increase its photosynthetic ability, which we then need to even get more iron in the future, we might need to apply some iron as a foliar, because if we apply it to the soil, it'll then oxidize, depending on the soil. But it's a little way to kick the system to then allow it to, I guess, kickstart. So iron, that's a good example with iron. A lot of the minerals with photosynthesis are a great example, because it's just getting that plant to that next stage to then cycle through.
That's a good point. Iron's an interesting one because you always see abundance of it on soil tests, and I think that's largely because it's in that oxidized form, and once it does that, that's what shows up in our soil testing. And it's something that's become more in the last couple of months in my wheelhouse of how important it is to photosynthesis. So I still need to do a fair bit more in that space, but I like the idea of feeding the plant with foliar to kickstart that process, but you're still also understanding like what's totally there in that parent material, because there's no point feeding it hoping that there's stuff in the parent material if you don't really know what's there as well.
Yeah, and it comes back to the economic part of it. We don't want to continuously apply foliar or any foliar. If we can get to a point where we're not doing foliars and maybe even like a little bit of starter fertilizer and the plant's like perfect, then that's where we want to get to. We don't really we talk about how great foliars are, but it's just a one tool in the toolbox to achieve a particular goal. And once that goal is achieved, we don't need to use them. Unless we have a goal again to use it. Ideally, you just be using the minerals in your soil, and that would be the ideal case in terms of regenerative agriculture, because your biology is strong enough. Yeah,
100%. I feel like a lot of my conversations recently have involved foliar in some sort of form.
Yeah, same.
It seems I don't feel like it's all that well utilised in New Zealand across the board. But like you say, it's such a great tool to kickstart things along. But it's not the silver bullet.
No,
it's helping to shift that system, I guess, along when you terms of your framework. It's helping to shift you along that framework of where you are and where you're trying to go.
Yeah, and it's a little bit of a buzz probably at the moment with foliars, and it depends on what you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to make capital applications of, say, phosphorus because you don't have any in your parent material, you can't quite make large applications of phos or nitrogen with your foliar. So, a few times I got a SAP test back, and you're deficient in phos. Phosphorus applications are very expensive, so So in that case, it was better to make a chicken manure application to the soil, just because you could get a whole bulk, you get a lot on. Whereas a foliar is just that single hit, and if you don't have any in the soil, then you're not gonna that hit to increase photosynthesis. Doesn't matter if you don't have it in the soil.
Yeah, it's a very short-term game, isn't it?
Yep.
You get the hit, and then if there's nothing in behind it to bulk it up, then it's just ultimately going to fall over because there's no resilience there. Yeah. In terms of the foliar space and people utilising it, do you see some common mistakes around how it's utilised in a system?
Yeah, I think from a higher level, it's putting too much emphasis on the foliar to supply the bulk of your program. We can talk about all the little nitty gritty things of making sure you have clean water and using surfactant, but I think the big problem is I might get a client and they say, I just want to use foliars. It's well, that's great, but why? What do you actually want to achieve? And we can use foliars, but it needs to be a part of an integrated approach. And if you're trying to get on all this, say, nitrogen fertilizer, and you're just starting off, unless you want to be making a lot of tractor passes, you can't quite use a foliar only approach. Like that's typically the big problem I see with foliars or people's attitudes to them. Is that this magic fix. The thing that is really great about foliars is that they're super efficient. And so say like nitrogen, 1 kilo of nitrogen, foliar nitrogen is about 3 kilos of soil applied nitrogen. And so there's some big, cost savings there. And if you're not making an extra pass, you can just put it on the same tank. And as long as it's all compatible, then should be right. And then you get the savings. The other big benefit of a foliar is that it bypasses your soil completely. And so when we're starting to think about, if we add too much nitrogen, that's going to inhibit nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen fixation in our soil tends to stop past 20 parts per million or 25 parts per million of mineral nitrogen. So one of the benefits of, say, a foliar is if you just get onto the plant and it doesn't touch the soil, your nitrogen-fixing bacteria can continue to fix nitrogen, like even if it's for a couple extra weeks. That's beneficial. And we can take that, say, off our top dressing program.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that's a pretty good comprehensive covering off of foliar, which is always good.
There's a lot to get into. But,
yeah, you can go in there, but I think that is the main one. Like I've transitioned guys to utilising foliars at different times, and then they go, if they don't own the equipment themselves, it's more expensive to put on. So like, can I just use it for the capital ones? I'm like, no, you can't.
yeah.
Those are the ones we don't want to do with the capital. This is the foliar. So it's got these windows within the season where we'll use it. So if we think about like a farmer who's looking to, transition their farm, starting to drive things with a biological sense is what they're actually trying to achieve and regenerate their farm, how should they shift their mindset around what their budgeting kind of side of it should look like?
Like unless there's any big problems, unless there's like really big problems and we can make massive cuts because simply your plants don't need it, unless that's the case, typically it should just work out neutral. And so with nitrogen, we try and target a 10 to 20% reduction in nitrogen in the first year. And so we get that reduction, but we're also spending that money on pretty much other things. Yep. And so we might add, humic acid to our starter fertilizer and top dressing. We might add some seed treatments. So mycorrhizal fungi seed treatment, which is pretty expensive. It's like $7 or so a hectare. So that might use up some of the money. We might put some more of the money towards a foliar, a mid-season foliar. So ideally, it should work out cost neutral. Or actually, at a minimum, it should work out cost neutral. Ideally, we should actually get a increase in profit. But when we're starting to regenerate, I think what's beneficial is like we drive that additional cash flow to then reinvest into other things if you want to, I guess. Yeah, neutral, positive, and then reinvestment. So you might not see any so much bottom line you can go buy a new thing with, but overall it should be regenerating or improving your farm.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. There's also some situations where additional investment is actually required because people have been running things almost too lean, I feel.
Yep.
To actually kickstart the system along that process. Have you encountered that as well?
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. So, especially like I had a client a while back, and so they went on this regenerative journey, right? And they went down that steep yield drop. Yep. And so I guess on that case, like if they really weren't spending anything anyways, you kind of have to spend more. I do wonder, like there's some people in the space, they just don't add anything. And like they seem happy with it, which is like if that's their goal, then that's cool. But I do wonder, like if you just put a very like an application of like urea with a few trace minerals, could you get a whole extra ton? And it's like that ton pays for itself quite quickly. Or that application pays for itself quite quickly with an extra $300. Like I do wonder about that. But yeah, it comes down to the goals.
Yeah, I see people, classic one is I don't want to use any synthetics, but in a bit of a difficult season, because they don't use any, a small amount of nitrogen just to kick that pasture along would actually help to photosynthesize and get the microbiology going, give them a bit more buffer. And inherently, because it's a small amount and they don't use a lot of it, the actually efficiency of that is probably going to be really good. So it's actually an economic outcome that's not degenerating what they're trying to do either.
Yeah, I think it's the appeal to nature fallacy is quite strong in the space. And like, don't get me wrong, I wouldn't want to be using, like, I don't use toxic chemicals and stuff, but a lot of your minerals, like a lot of your fertilizer, it's just like salt, like your table salt, sodium chloride. It's basically the same as like all the other salts, to some extent. But we shouldn't be too scared about chemicals, like the chemicals in the sense of urea or something. What we do need to keep in mind, though, is just the pros and cons. And so there's pros and cons to everything we do, and it's just weighing up that balance between, what do we want to achieve versus the pros and cons and how we're going to get there.
Yeah, that is the most important thing, is you just understanding what is the influence of what I'm trying to do here, and can I buffer that, and then make the decision off the back of that. I think if you're doing that all the time, then you will inherently make the right decisions a lot of the time. Because if not, you'll learn.
Because even with say herbicide, like if you don't apply, in some cases, if you don't apply a herbicide, then that can result in a big yield drop. So no, we don't want that to happen. So what's the next best thing? We try and buffer it. We add some extra carbon sources and biostimulants to allow our non-selected plants to come back. Like there's ways to mitigate against things. And we don't have to get too dogmatic about certain practices.
Yeah. The amount of people who I've had conversations with around cultivation.
Yep.
Like, it's actually sometimes better to set that paddock up by giving it a bit of a tickle up and allowing to maybe fix some of the structure issues, and then those plants can actually photosynthesize and pump that sugar into the soil, rather than not doing anything and then getting half the yield and in 3 years' time still having to do the same thing.
Yep, I agree. I've made those recommendations as well.
Yeah, but it's funny how many people get dogmatic about just the cultivation thing, or the chemical, or the nitrogen, and it's like, well, actually, just understanding the influence and utilising the tools that are available for you, and then if that actually ultimately sets you up better for the longer term regeneration, then fantastic. That's what we're trying to achieve, isn't it? Yeah.
But it's also like, if we could get away without a fungicide or something it's like, well, what? I don't want it. Why bother using it if you can get away with it? So it's just it's balance.
And like some seasons, you need the fungicide because it's particularly wet, or other seasons you'll be sweet, so it's not the blanket approach. So it's that's probably one of my regular frustrations, is that people get themselves into these boxes that they don't need to put themselves into. And we just got to use the tools that are best there for us. So I finish up all my podcasts with this one question, which is, what's one belief or principle that keeps you grounded no matter what season of life you're in? Yeah,
I think at the end of the day, like, God's got it all under control. And I come from a Christian background and believe that God's got it all under control. So that's kind of what keeps me grounded.
Yeah. No, that's pretty good. So for anyone who's listening, what's the best way to connect with you, Teale, and learn more about what you do?
So if you Google Agrisol or Teal Simmons, I'll probably come up, to be honest. I got a good trace of content out there. So I pretty much put a video out weekly on YouTube, just kind of lecture type content to help people learn more about it. And then getting pretty active on Instagram and Facebook. Also, like the website too. There's plenty of free tools on the website, so you can help yourself to that.
Yeah, pretty awesome. I'll link those below, and I seriously recommend checking out the YouTube. It's some of the better explanations of concepts that are really important to farming, regardless if you're into regenerative or not. It's fantastic resource. So thank you very much for coming on today, Teale. That was been a fantastic yarn. Hopefully we've answered a few questions for people listening.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
No problem.